Hello, and Merry Christmas. I'm Frank Cifaldi from the Video Game History Foundation. And in the 20th century American tradition of your well-meaning uncle gifting you the cheapest video game at Sears, my gift to you this year is Super Sushi Pinball. Now, whenever we talk about Sony and video games today, we're pretty much inevitably talking about the PlayStation, but this wasn't always the case. Before Sony had its own console, they actually published games for other systems, often based on Sony's own movies, under its Epic Records music label in Japan, and through a dedicated video game spin-off company in the US, Sony ImageSoft. When ImageSoft first announced itself to the world in January of 1989, it promised to localize 3 Famicom games from Japan. This was the humble beginning of Sony as an American video game publisher, an important and I'd say pretty crucial moment in the history of games. Now, despite advertisements and trade show appearances, only one of these 3 titles, Super Dodgeball, was ever released. The other 2 games, Super Rescue and Super Sushi Pinball, were considered lost media, until we met Ed. Ed Semrad is best known today as the former editor of Electronic Gaming Monthly magazine, but he actually began his career as a weekly syndicated newspaper columnist reviewing video games. This was pretty rare in the 1980s, so he was on a lot of mailing lists when publishers sent out games. Often, these games were sent on prototype cartridges because the game had not yet been completed or manufactured. Sometimes the games he was sent would never be manufactured at all. We recently dug through Ed's basement and uncovered a massive collection of prototype games, many of which were never released. We digitized every last one of the things and contributed the data to various prototype research sites. If you're interested in that story and in checking them out, we've linked to a blog post about it below. Now, among his stash, we found what we currently believe to be the only surviving copy of Super Sushi Pinball, a holy grail of Sony video game history. Now, based on the screenshots of Super Sushi Pinball that ImageSoft published at the time, I was expecting a pretty straightforward version of Super Pinball, the game that was released in Japan, but upon booting the prototype for the first time, I was flabbergasted by one of the strangest introductions I've ever seen in a video game. Okay, before we begin, I want to tell you that all of this was made possible by donations to the Video Game History Foundation, the charity I founded in 2016. I don't just mean the production of this video, although that's included too. I mean everything, including the time and expense needed to fly to Ed's house to rescue this game. As this video is being published, we're getting toward the end of our annual winter fundraiser, the most important time of year for us. The charitable contributions we receive during this period help us decide what projects to pursue next year, projects like this one. If you appreciate what we're doing, you like the video, you want to see more, head on over to gamehistory.org, sign up for our email list, and give if you're able. We'd really appreciate that. So, Super Sushi Pinball. One might think the sushi theming of this game comes from its origins in Japan, because sushi is a Japanese food, but it's not. The original Super Pinball has absolutely nothing to do with sushi. The theming of the table is actually focused on sports cars and outer space. All of the sushi theming was actually tacked on specifically for the American version. This unique intersection of Eastern and Western cultures is established immediately in the game's opening, where the Statue of Liberty herself slaps down a piece of tuna nigiri. And then, this. This text crawl goes on for nearly 2 minutes. In it, we learn about sushi's history, its assimilation into American cuisine, the invention of the California roll, which was still relatively new at the time, and some Japanese words one might hear in a sushi restaurant, none of which I've actually heard in a sushi restaurant. By the end of the text crawl, the text goes on to admit that the pinball game doesn't actually have anything to do with sushi. The game itself is pretty much identical to Super Pinball, though I did notice some text differences. Crush levels are now smash points. Complete Crush is now a much easier to understand Smash All. And English spelling mistakes in general have been corrected. But it's in this final area of the game that we see the biggest difference. In the original, this is where the player would collect a mahjong tile. Here, instead, they collect the game's promised secret piece of sushi. And while the original ended with a cheesecake shot of an undressed woman on a sports car, Super Sushi Pinball ends on one last weird note related to its retheming. A really elaborate set of instructions on how to use chopsticks, complete with animations. This whole thing is a bizarre idea, but you can tell that it's someone's bizarre idea. There's a sincerity to this that I really appreciate. Someone really thought that this pinball game might be a good way to teach kids about foreign culture, and they really stuck to the bit. So, that's Super Sushi Pinball. But why didn't it come out in the first place? What is it that robbed us of this masterpiece? Well, we might actually have an answer. Blake Harris's 2014 book Console Wars says, seemingly from an interview with Olaf Olafsson of ImageSoft, that the game had been flat out rejected by Nintendo and would never be released. Now, that very well could be, but rather than take their word on it, I wanted to flex VGHF's archive and show more of a paper trail. Our earliest record for Super Sushi Pinball dates back to its original quality submission check to Nintendo of America. This was back in December of 1988. At the time, it was rated a 20 out of 40, which isn't great, but there were plenty of 20 or below games that actually did make it out. The first time this game was ever seen outside of Sony or Nintendo that we know of was the following month at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. This is when ImageSoft first announced itself to the world. And this is where Ed Semrad first saw the game. And according to this asterisk in his column, he liked it. This singular asterisk, which generically notes that he liked the game, is the only opinion ever published about Super Sushi Pinball. And it was published by the only person who kept a copy of the game, and he got the name wrong. Now, in mid-1989, quite a few things relevant to the game happened. We believe that the game passed lot check at Nintendo in May. This was and still is Nintendo's process for approving games for manufacturing. This isn't the same thing as the quality check. It's actually a test where Nintendo tries to break the game and look for critical bugs. In June, the game was marketed again at the summer version of the Consumer Electronics Show. And then somewhere around this time, between June and October, depending on your source, ImageSoft published its first game, Super Dodgeball. And it actually came with a fold-out poster announcing the imminent arrival of Super Sushi Pinball. A similar announcement ran in magazine ads for the game. The last time anyone ever saw Super Sushi Pinball was in January of 1990, at that year's Winter CES, where it was likely drowned out by ImageSoft's brand new announcement, Solstice. It's possible that this is the last time anyone besides me played Super Sushi Pinball, and its final appearance in a print ad was in the April 1990 edition of Electronic Gaming Monthly. Now, given that magazines typically had about a 3-month lead time, give or take, it's kind of safe to assume that the game was canceled somewhere around that January show, if not literally because of it. Going back to Harris's quote about Nintendo flat out rejecting the game, is it true? We don't know. But I have a hard time imagining that ImageSoft would advertise a game for an entire year if it were completely rejected. If I had to guess, I think a more likely scenario is that Nintendo wouldn't manufacture as many units as Sony wanted them to. But it's just a guess, and I have not been able to get word from anyone involved on either side of that relationship, and not for a lack of trying. I've now met a lot of really nice people who worked at ImageSoft, but none of them were around that early on. Olaf, if you're watching this, get in the comments, hit me up on my email. Okay, before I set you loose to open your real presents, I want to talk about just how tenuous this kind of history can be. We only know which trade shows this game appeared at from two sources. There was a series of CES handouts by Game Players magazine, of which one copy of each is known to exist. This is all of them. We actually had to borrow the ones we were missing from the private collectors that had the other ones. And then also a little-known newsletter called Computer Entertainer, which is so rare that we believe we have the only complete volumes. The volumes that were originally owned by the magazine's editors. But don't worry, the issues that featured Super Sushi Pinball, we do know of exactly one other copy of those because we have those too. It was the only eBay hit for this publication that I know of in the last 10 years, and we were the only bidders. That flyer that I showed you with the box art, the only place this art was ever published to my knowledge, I know of two of these. I had to fly out to Texas to scan this myself, so I had a copy to reference and show you. This isn't a real one. Remember how I was able to tell you exactly when Nintendo evaluated the game and what score they gave it? That's a single sheet of paper that a former Nintendo employee, as far as we know, accidentally took home when they left. They sent us a digital photo for this video. And let's not forget the game itself, the only known copy of Super Sushi Pinball in the entire world that we know of, was sitting forgotten in a Chicago area basement for over 30 years from the only person who ever reviewed it, with an asterisk. Now look, it's no exaggeration to say that telling this story would have been literally impossible if not for the support and generosity you've all shown us over these past 6 years. This kind of work just doesn't happen unless it's someone's job. And my God, if you're someone who is given to our charity, you did this. You made this our jobs. And if you haven't joined us yet, but you'd like to, there's links in the description to get started today. Once again, I'm Frank Cifaldi from the Video Game History Foundation. Merry Christmas. We'll see you next year.